Welcome to the Food Junkies podcast. Here, we aim to provide you with the experience, strength, and hope of professionals actively working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. The purpose of our show is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a disease with abstinence as the solution. Here, we talk about all things recovery. Most importantly, how to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, tell others about your change, and hopefully the message will spread.
Hey there, Food Junkies listeners. Thank you so much for helping us to reach 100,000 downloads before January 1st, 2022. As a thank you, Vera, Clarissa, and I have created a video for your viewing pleasure. Be sure to check out the Facebook groups for a chance to see that. All right, for today's episode, we have Dr. Kim Dennis. Dr. Kim, as she is known, has been treating addictions, substance, process, and food, mood disorders, eating disorders, PTSD, and personality disorders for more than a decade. In 2016, she co-founded SunCloud Health and currently serves as Chief Medical Officer and CEO. Kim Dennis is a board-certified psychiatrist who specializes in treating addictions, eating disorders, and co-occurring disorders. She has helped thousands of remarkable people with their illnesses. Her knowledge of eating disorders and addiction isn't just limited to her academic and clinical experience, having had her own personal experience as a woman in recovery from an eating disorder and alcoholism. Today, she's able to combine her personal journey with her medical training to help SunCloud Health patients become emotionally strong, responsible problem solvers who are inspired to create fulfilling lives for themselves. She believes in and maintains a holistic perspective in the practice of psychiatry, incorporating biological, psychosocial, and spiritual approaches into the individually tailored treatment programs for each patient at SunCloud Health. In today's episode, we hear Dr. Kim's story about her SunCloud program and what it looks like, how her team treats food addiction and eating disorder, and how they separate the signal from the noise, different treatment interventions for the physiological and psychological symptoms of this disease. We briefly touch on fasting. We talk about volume eating and addiction. We talk about harm reduction and abstinence. We cover scales and body weight and weight bias. We talk about the ever importance of community. And as a special treat, be sure to tune in next week for a special part 2 to our interview with Dr. Kim Dennis. All right, here we go. Welcome, Dr. Kim.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kim, for being here with us today. Will you share with us your personal story and how it intertwines with your professional journey?
Yes. So I'm an adult psychiatrist, board certified. I did all of my training at the University of Chicago. That's medical school, research, residency, and college. And when I was in college there, I started experiencing eating disorder symptoms that looked like binging and purging. And I also, for the first time ever, had alcohol. And I come from, a long family lineage of alcoholism. So the genes were there. I experienced a lot in the way of trauma growing up in an alcoholic household, physical abuse, sexual abuse. My father died when I was 11. So that's what I was sort of coming into the University of Chicago with. And I had lots of God-given talents, I was a great athlete. I was intellectually gifted, and I got to the U of C and felt very, very different from all of the other smart people who were there with professors and lawyers and doctors as parents. My dad didn't finish high school. He was a welder. My mom finished high school and was very bright, but never went to college. We grew up, we were on food stamps and powdered milk. And I was in a dorm with a bunch of people who had what seemed like from the outside, a very, very different life experience than I did. So that's how my eating disorder started, just by happenstance. I would eat while the other humans around me connected and conversed and talked politics. And it really served to metabolize, I think, my anxiety and the shame that I brought to the table coming from where I came from. And it's not something I told anybody about ever, but I did try to get help in college. So I was a college athlete. I played basketball there. And at the Student Counseling Center. It's probably a year after it started. My second year of college, I got accepted early into medical school. And I really wanted to be able to use, the next 3 years. I was afraid of what was happening with food interfering with me being able to use the college years in the ways that I wanted to, and then also be able to actually go to medical school and do well in medical school and become a doctor. I wanted to be a doctor from the time I was 2 and my dad, not 2, but maybe second grade, and my dad was sick. So it got worse, as addiction does over time. The binges became bigger, the frequency became bigger, until 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line, in my junior and senior year of college, I was binging and purging almost every day. And then by medical school, every single day, relentlessly, all throughout the day. And I knew it was something that I couldn't stop. But the College Counseling Center, when I first went, was like, it's not that bad. We can only do 6 sessions anyways. So good luck. And then I had tried a couple other times to seek out therapists in the Hyde Park community, and there weren't eating disorder specialists. And the ones that I did share what was going on would be horrified and I don't know how to help you. I hope you make it back next week, which is a terrible thing to hear from a person, especially. I think most doctors, most people who've been traumatized don't think very highly of asking anyone for anything, especially help. And then to cross that threshold and ask and be met with, yeah, that's really messed up. We don't know how to help you, felt like a death sentence to me. And I had pretty much surrendered to, in medical school, I'm just going to die of this, and that's okay. And that's where I was at. And I finally found a therapist who had addiction and eating disorders experience, which is rare. It's rare now. It was really rare back then. And that guy saved my life and was able to talk about what was going on with food for me as part of the disease of addiction. And I started going to 12-step meetings, both around food and around alcohol, with a lot of resistance. It wasn't hey, you should go to these mutual support groups. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. It was not like that at all. But eventually, there were people in those meetings who had nutritionists who understood food addiction, which, again, extremely rare, And I just feel like I was blessed, with grace to have found people, the very few people who were able to say to me, I think there are certain food substances that may be fueling this for you. Yes, you have an eating disorder. You need to restore weight, and we want to help you have normalized eating. And there may be some food substances that just aren't safe for you to eat. It's that level of sophistication between food addiction doesn't exist. All food's fit for all people all the time, which is dogma and insane. And everything's food addiction. Everybody with an eating disorder shouldn't be eating, sugar and white flour is dangerous for everybody with an eating disorder. Neither of those are accurate. And for many, it's, there's overlap. There's huge biodiversity. And I think if I was at a standard eating disorder treatment center, I would have died, quite honestly. So I got abstinent from binging and purging on April 11th of 2001, and feel like I recovered from my eating disorder within the next, 2 or 3 years. And there are certain food substances that I have learned for my body elicit a biochemical reaction in my brain that is simply not safe for me, which is very different than I don't want to eat that food because I'm afraid I'm going to be fat. And there are people who have that. And I think our job as clinicians is to think about eating disorders as biological. Cynthia Bulick talks about them as, a physiogenetic disorder, which has physiology under it. It has genes under it. It has our society that we live in under it. It has thin bias. It's so complicated. There are so many different facets that I think anybody who says this is true for all eating disorders is out of their mind.
So how did that then evolve into what you do today? Like, how did that personal intertwine then with that professional? And you were like, I'm going to be a doctor. This is who I'm going to work with. This is how I'm going to treat people. How did that come to be?
Yeah. So that's a great question, because I was very, from the time I knew I was going to be a doctor, like in my head, like when my therapist said, like, you need to go to treatment, you need to at least like look at a PHP or an IOP program. And I was like, not going to happen. Like, I will not do that because I am in medical school, and I don't recommend this, but I did a more intensive outpatient treatment, but I was in medical school while I was doing this. And I ended up taking I went to my dean and said, I'd like to do a year of research. And I really did want to do research, but the primary purpose of taking that year was to get out of the hospital, like 4 a.m. to 8 or 9 p.m. schedule and put some time into getting help and healing. And during that year, one of the attendings who was running basically a process group for medical students and then a process group for once I got into residency, I decided psychiatry. So in that year off, I had to decide what specialty I was going into. I loved surgery just because it was so concrete and black and white. And what I discovered in that year, though, was it was okay for me to, and important for me to put like life balance and what I want to do with other areas of my life into the equation on making that decision, which felt like a very scary thing to do at the time. But there was one patient on the inpatient psychiatric unit. Like, I had a great experience there, and the time just went by, which I think is a good sign. Like, if you're doing something and you don't care if it's 6 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night or 4 o'clock in the afternoon when you leave, I think that's a good sign. I had that experience in the OR. I had that experience on my psychiatric rotation. And I ended up deciding psychiatry because I didn't really want to spend like the next 10 years only working and training, because I was looking to do a surgical subspecialty, not just general surgery, of course. So I decided to do a residency in psychiatry. But even then, I was like, I would never treat some like addiction or eating disorder patients, because there was something that felt like shameful about that. Like, how could you, as a person who has had these things, treat people? It felt way too close to home. And that really, my world sort of like gelled into a hole after one of these supervision groups with this psychiatrist who disclosed he was in recovery from an eating disorder. And his whole practice was addictions and eating disorders. And people would, like my therapist said, if you were a cardiologist and you had stent in your heart, would you think it's inappropriate for that cardiologist to do his job? And I was like, well, of course not. So really that was a key moment for me and a key experience. And I ended up working with the psychiatrist after I finished residency and starting a residential at the same time. So I got a lot of great training, a lot of great mentorship from the psychiatrist, a guy named Jeffrey Roth in Chicago.
Awesome. It's just so wonderful how personal can become professional. And It sounds to me like this is a passion for you. And it's someone who has experienced that polarized treatment in eating disorder and addiction, and not having either of them be the right fit, to have a clinic that treats both and can, muddle through the noise of what is what and what is the best individualized treatment plan. I think that is, because exactly like you said, right? There's no one treatment that's going to work for everyone. So can you tell us a little bit more about your clinic, your program, your treatments? What kind of professionals are on your team?
Yeah. So one other thing about my training, I spent a year working with Daniel LaGrange because we had an academic eating disorder clinic at the University of Chicago, which is rare. Like most medical students and residents get no eating disorder training. So I had that in the background too, and I knew I loved working with that patient population. But that too was like research, which is very specific, very black and white. This is the treatment that we're studying and this is how we do it. So I just wanted to throw in that little piece that I forget about sometimes, but that too was very influential to me. But our clinic here, so from the outset, the artificial DSMology of mental health never made sense to me. It seemed like pseudoscience. It seemed to not fit many patients who have 3, 4 different quote unquote primary diagnoses all happening at the same time. And also, I'm the type of person and I have the type of brain that can see similarities. I think you were mentioning where's the signal underneath all the noise? So there's huge overlap between addiction, obsessive compulsive disorder, anorexia, bulimia, binge, even patients with eating disorders can have all 3 of those if you look at the course of their 20 years of having an eating disorder. So I've always had an eye towards let's treat the individual, let's respect their biodiversity, and let's look at what is the underlying pathophysiology. That helps me as a psychiatrist, even if I'm just talking about psychopharmacology, look at, well, instead of treating everybody who has this DSM diagnosis with the same medication, addiction is a great example of this. Some people with addiction have dopamine receptor issues. Some people with addiction have dopamine production issues. Some people with addiction have something else going on neurochemically. And the tools that I have, the relatively limited tools that we have in our pharmacology box need to be selected based on what we think would help the person's brain, not just, well, they have depression and this is FDA approved for depression, so this is what I'm going to use. And we really have built our practice and our clinics here using that model, which is, I think, I'm biased, but I think a sophisticated model. It's not, and we've been able to handpick clinicians who want more than just cookie cutter medicine, cookie cutter psychiatry, who are able to really incorporate non-dual treatment approaches and non-dual therapies and a non-dual treatment model, essentially. And that's hard. A lot of new clinicians really want, what's the policy? How many times, if this happens, I just want you to tell me what to do 100% of the time. And there are some broad strokes that exists for, but so much in what we see clinically is not going to be the same answer for patient X as it is for patient Y. So our clinic is really built on treating people with complex co-occurring addictions and eating disorders, being able to treat patients in a truly patient-specific way. This is very rare when it comes to nutrition and, nutritional therapy. Many eating disorder professionals that I talk to are like, how do you do that at a meal support table when someone with restricting anorexia sees somebody with food addiction not having a cupcake for her snack? And we do that because from the intake process, from the, okay, you are a person who wants to receive treatment here, let's give you informed consent. These are the things that we look at. These are the things that we believe in. There are some people that can't tolerate some of the boundaries that we set around coming to SunCloud for treatment, or who aren't interested in, for example, trying alternatives to stimulants or benzodiazepines. There are some people who shouldn't get off of stimulants or benzodiazepines. And those are folks that we have wonderfully have a whole number of other treatment centers who will support that. There are people who don't want to stop using marijuana every night, because it helps them with X, Y, or Z. That's totally fine. We respect that. Here are 3 other treatment centers who will support that. So I think that gives sort of a pretty clear overview, just philosophically, of where we come from. We have intensive outpatient, PHP at 3 different locations in the Chicago area. And we just opened a 21-bed residential unit last month as well, which is super exciting.
That is super exciting. And I'm a master's level dual clinician, mental health and substance use disorder licensed addiction counselor. So like everything you're saying just gets me so excited. And I was telling Clarissa and the other ladies who are listening in today that I was like, maybe after this interview, I can come shadow at one of you guys' clinics.
That'd be great.
It's just so exciting. I mean, where I live, we have a PHP, IOP, and just regular level 1 outpatient eating disorder clinic right here in the community in which I live. In fact, I think it's the biggest one in the Southwest. I could be wrong about that, but they don't deal with the addiction part, and I don't know that they even address food. I don't even know that food addiction is even on the radar, let alone that there could be addiction going on in these cycles of the eating disorders, right? In the like endogenous endorphins and like just getting addicted to that cycle. So I get so excited when I hear about programs like yours, because to me, it's a fantasy, right? Like that's the dream that I've had for a while now. And then here it turns out people are already doing it. So thank you for coming before us and doing that.
But there's a lot of shade thrown at me in the eating disorder world.
Oh, I'm sure.
And there are even people who are like, oh, like take the addicts. Like we don't want to treat them. Like those are the people that wreak havoc on our milieu.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I get that all the time. Yeah.
We see food addiction, but we don't talk about it, and we would never say we treat it. We just keep that behind closed doors with this one patient, which is stigmatizing. And, the implicit message there is like, there's something wrong with you. Don't talk about this.
Yeah. Or if word got out, then we'd be overrun or something. Yeah. Exactly. So will you walk us through then how you decipher which clients need like eating disorder treatment versus food addiction treatment? Like, do you use the food addiction scale or do you have some sort of screening or assessment process?
Well, I mean, just to start with, we don't even take a stance of eating disorder versus food addiction, right? So there are people who have eating disorders alone. There are people who have eating disorders plus food addiction, and there are people who have food addiction alone. So we use, a standard diagnostic interview, standard psychiatric interview, and then the nutritionist does a detailed history, food history, weight history, behavior history, cognitive areas of the disease history. We look at growth curves as well when we have access to them. And we use the Yale Food Addiction Scale 2.0, but we don't just use that because there are plenty of false positives on the Yale Food Addiction Scale. We know that chronic undernourishment and chronic deprivation can produce something that looks like addiction, right? Because the reward center becomes more and more sensitized as body weight decreases. That's not usually food addiction. Food addiction, Timothy Brereton and David Wiss wrote a really nice paper about this, like teasing out the signal from the noise. And some of the stuff that they talked about is exactly what we train our clinicians in, what we train our nutritionists in. Here are the risk factors. And just because somebody has a risk factor doesn't mean they have it. So the risk factors, the sort of like other risk factors we look at, we try to screen out anybody whose disease started with deprivation and cutting out sugar. Most of our patients who truly have food addiction and who respond well to a nutritional philosophy that supports them in having a low exposure meal plan are people who started off with out of control behaviors, out of control binging and purging. Many of them have personal histories of addiction or very, very heavy genetic loading for addiction. And almost all of them have histories of early developmental trauma. So if somebody has all of those factors, if they have failed standard treatments, 2, 3, 4 times, we're going to try something different. And those are some of the things that go into deciding. Patient preference obviously is part of it as well. And I think the biggest thing that we want to make sure that we're doing is that we're not taking something as food addiction that is a restrictive eating disorder, whether that's anorexia nervosa, higher body weight anorexia nervosa, or lower body weight anorexia nervosa.
So we often talk about food addiction as a physiological, but also a behavioral addiction. And so how do you work differently, or how do those treatments co-align? Because, food addiction is the substance use disorder, and, what part of it is the process addiction? Can you talk about how the treatments for that might differ or how they work together?
Yeah. So using, and this was one of my questions early on as a clinician. Well, when somebody says food addiction, do they mean the person is addicted to the process and the rituals and the endogenous, the chemical milieu that happens when somebody restricts also looks like addiction, right? So, and that too is metabogenetic. That is, so it's when I say process addiction involving food and eating related behaviors, that includes many patients with anorexia, right? Because you talk to somebody and the studies are starting to emerge looking at reward saliency and reward circuitry in anorexia. For so long, we approached research with patients with anorexia from a mind of somebody who doesn't have anorexia. Right. So I have a normal mind, and as a normal mind person, what's rewarding to me is food. Right. Hard for researchers to even conceive that what's people with anorexia, they have great delayed gratification. Not true. What a person with anorexia gets really gratified by is not eating, and that's not just psychological. There's something that happens biologically that I think is at the root of the hyperactivity that we see in anorexia. People, when they are in their disease, feel high, describe feeling high, many people, so even that, I think for many patients with anorexia have an addictive process going on. For people with bulimia and binge eating disorder, sometimes with restricting anorexia, the treatment for that isn't avoid sugar or white flour. And I think part of why food addiction gets a bad rap is because the few places historically that have done it, or substance abuse treatment centers that do it in a very rigid, all or nothing way, and that actually hurts, just as much as not acknowledging food addiction hurts that subset of patients. Food as substance addiction hurts that subset of patients that actually have it. Saying that food addiction is, for everyone with an eating disorder hurts a whole lot of people with eating disorders who don't have it. So this is another area of complexity to the picture, because when it is about food as a substance, the treatment for that needs to incorporate the substances that we're actually supporting a patient putting into their body. When it's about the process, our focus is on interventions, behavioral interventions, mutual support interventions, behavioral activation around breaking those routines, which too is we have research that shows the top-down, ingrained, habitual, frontostriatal brain circuit. And I think the more we know about what's going on biologically, the more both therapy and biologic tools we'll have to help make the brain more flexible, and I think regardless of what the eating disorder diagnosis is, one of the hallmarks of health in psychiatry is flexibility, and brain flexibility. And how often do we see in our field academics, clinicians who show and demonstrate no capacity to hold more than their own tunnel vision? This is what eating disorder treatment is.
Yeah, as you were explaining that, I had a couple of thoughts. One, all the fasting that everybody's doing. And I don't know, I know I can speak for Clarissa because we talk about this. We often have these clients that are like, okay, I've been on this abstinent food plan or low exposure food plan for X amount of days. When can I start fasting? And then they want to do, and it's not just can I just do time restricted eating where kitchen closes after my last meal and it doesn't open again until breakfast. It's, I want to do 2 weeks. And I'm like, what? And then, and they're talking about, yeah, and it feels so good. And if, and people are glorifying it, on social media. And it just reminded me of what you were talking about, with when anorexia nervosa individuals and they get that high of restricting, that is their gratification. And I just wonder, is that the same or very similar mechanisms happening with that phenomena that's happening right now with all this fasting stuff, first and foremost. And then I think the other part too is when you were talking about the differences between food as a substance and food as a process, is it possible? And I think it is possible because I think I have clients who go through this, and I think myself even as well, the substance piece we take out, right? So no longer are we eating those things, the sugar, flour, grains, fill in the blank, whatever it is that's acting psychoactively for them. But then there's still this return to overeating or using Brussels sprouts or carrots or broccoli or something, right? And it's not necessarily a binge, but certainly there's a seeking of something going on with that. And so is that emotional eating or is that food addiction as a process?
It's hard to know, and it's also, this concept of flexibility that I think in recovery people grow into and get more connected to their body and their intuition and can feel like maybe I ate, more than I would have if X, Y, or Z wasn't going on, and it's okay. So getting to a place of like, part of like normal human behavior is having waxes and wanes in what we're consuming. I don't think somebody with food addiction or an eating disorder goes from like, I'm entering treatment to that in 2 weeks, So, and with that example that you use, sometimes we don't know, and I think helping people get to a place of like, you know what, we don't know. You're safe right now. This wasn't an objective binge. You didn't deprive yourself. You didn't like objectively binge. Is this emotional eating? We can talk about what's going on emotionally. Is this part of a process addiction? One of the topics that comes up a lot is volume addiction, which I think touches on what you're talking about. And that can both be a process, but also is a physical addiction because, that amount of fullness has very real biochemical, sensory, it's an experience. And I feel like I'm not giving you any straight answers here because it's so, it's just so the experience of eating and food and putting stuff into our bodies touches on so many different things. It touches on trauma for a lot of people, it touches on societal norms, it touches on the reward center, it touches on habit, touches on culture. So it can be infinitely complex. And I think when working with any individual patient, it's all a harm reduction model, like, is it harm reduction or is it abstinence? It's all harm reduction. Whether I'm treating somebody just with alcoholism, like those people don't stop drinking, smoking, overworking, gambling when they start addiction treatment. It's graded, and it's ongoing. So I think when I'm working with a patient, what I try to do with that example specifically is, well, let's start with what we feel like we really know, right? Like you have a history of bulimia or you have a history of binge eating disorder. When's the last time you had an objective, out of control binge that, was way out of bounds and you knew it and was damaging to you? And what is this? Maybe it's some of that, maybe it's not, and I think being able to hold patients in the ambiguity and support them in, it's kind of like an exposure response prevention, right? Like, let's expose you to ambiguity and let's support you in not responding with, I'm bad, I overate, I should go back to, weighing and measuring my food, which some people need pre-plated food at some points in their recovery. I haven't met, there are some people who have to do that ongoing, and that's okay too. But the majority of patients who get good treatment that's tailored to their biology and get trauma-informed treatment can get to a place where they're in tune with their body. Even if biogenetically, they don't have the capacity to register fullness cues, their bodies, after eating in a normalized way, builds body memory. And I think all people can learn to start trusting their bodies on a fundamental level. That I think is a message that we are given regardless of where we grow up. There's some like danger about your body. Like your body must look at this external way in order for you to be okay.
Yeah, I think that's so important to talk about because, we definitely have the individuals who come to us and they're so focused on the scale. And so then maybe they remove the substances, right? So they're off the flour and the sugar and, they're doing the mindful eating, they're doing everything else, but they still have the ruminating thoughts about the weight and the scale. And that is what is driving them back to the binges. Yep. So how do you work with clients around like body image and using the scale? Because I imagine, again, this is another piece of the puzzle in this field that we need to talk about.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think historically in the eating disorder world, we say like, don't ever weigh yourself. You don't need to know the number. Just turn that all over to your physicians. And for some people, that works and that's how it has to be. But that too, I think there are some people who do need to be exposed to what the number is so that they can trust in the process. It's like the thought of surrendering, I'm giving my whole body over to you is way too terrifying for a subset of patients who, have trauma histories, who have severe anorexia, who have severe binge eating disorder. But particularly in people, I see it a lot in people with food addiction, this obsession about I have to be quote unquote thin in order to be well. And I think that more than anything else keeps people stuck and keeps people sick. Or they get to this whatever thin weight and they're not at all what I would call serene, not at all. Sometimes being at an artificially low weight because it's on somebody's BMI chart can also propel things like, rigidity in thinking, ruminations about body image, depression. Our brains need glucose, and foods that can be broken down into glucose in ways that don't cause huge spikes in the reward center for people with food addiction in order for our brains to function and in order for us to make neurochemicals that are associated with well-being from a mood perspective. So, I've had patients with 20 years of quote unquote abstinence in what I will say is highly regimented, rigid eating programs where there are whole food groups that are cut out who have intractable depression, but they're quote unquote abstinent. And when you work to move the needle for those people to no grains, no carbs whatsoever, and being in ketogenesis 24/7 for years to we're going to expose you to carbohydrates and a variety of them that can be metabolized by your body and produce manageable, tolerable spikes in your reward center for you. If we have to add naltrexone and acamprosate on board to help you tolerate that, we will. But I can't treat your depression is going to stick around if you keep eating in this way. And I believe the two are connected. And that process is really hard to undo if somebody for the last 20 years has been eating anorexically, thinking that that's the solution to their binge eating disorder. Because when you re-expose people even to complex carbohydrates with a low glycemic index, because the reward center is now heightenedly, very, very heightened from years of deprivation, they feel like you're giving me something that is an allergy food for me, and it's a matter of providing support, providing psychoeducation, and just engaging them in let's do the trial. And if 2 weeks from now and 4 weeks from now, you feel the same way, we can revisit.
We have to have you back for a part 2 because I know there's just so many things that we're never going to get to, but I just again, our listeners can't see us, but Clarissa and I are nodding our heads. Yes. And I think, again, it's just been so nice. And this is probably why David pointed us in your direction, because you're speaking our language. We feel like we're often railing against this tidal wave of more concrete, the giants, the leaders that came before us. We're just met with opposition so often. I think it's just so refreshing and
I think
nice
it's more
hear.
than opposition.
Yeah, right. It is. I'm being kind here. Let's be. Yeah, that's true. Okay, fine. Thanks for calling me out. I'm being kind. It's way more than opposition. Yeah, and so I think I'm just I'm literally having this visceral just this wave of relief to hear you just say the things that you're saying, because I think I have practiced that way for so long, and and definitely moving into the food addiction world has only been in the last few years to just specialize in that area of it, but definitely treating mental health and substance use disorder across the board, and just knowing there are so many biases out there and there are so many problematic assumptions that people make, and things like the weight bias, like you were saying, being this restrictive, on this restrictive food plan for 20 years, but by God, I've got 20 years of abstinence, but they're depressed. And it's but if you're not introducing these foods that help create, right, it's the whole tryptophan, serotonin. I mean, there's a chemical thing that happens. I'm not smart enough to know it all, but exactly how that works, but I have enough knowledge to know that we need those things. And so, yeah, I mean, it's keeping us sick, but in a different way. Like if we're getting to the end of that 20 years or we're getting to our deathbed and we're like, but I had 50 years, but it was miserable because I didn't have enough serotonin or enough dopamine or oxytocin or something. Like, is that truly recovery, or is that just, hey, I was sober from those things, therefore I was well? Or like you were saying, that number on the scale, or if my body doesn't look a certain way, because there are clinicians in this field who do have a real weight bias, who will look at somebody who is literally in recovery off those substances and say, well, they must not be doing something right because they're still in a larger sized body.
The worst.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Within the field, especially, there's plenty of primary care doctors that do that all day, every day to the masses.
Yes.
But we hope within this field that we can, get to a level of just a little bit more sophistication, we talk about inclusivity all the time, right? Mm-hmm. And the eating disorder world is, unless you are fully recovered, unless you eat all foods because they fit for everybody, you don't count. Your voice doesn't count. There's not treatment for you. If you're a professional that treats it, you're excluded, and not in person because everybody's nice, but behind the scenes
and very backhandedly, like on social media, using social media platforms to just like, it's craziness for sure. And then you think about all the young people that are mostly on social media and seeing those messages. So because we're running out of time, I really, really, really want you to answer this for our listeners, or explain for our listeners the importance of dopamine receptor density and how community really impacts that. Like just really driving home the importance of community.
So that's another piece that I think, when I hear people railing against 12-step support or 12-step communities for people with eating disorders. We know, this is one of the few things we know, when people are socially isolated, their dopamine receptor density decreases. We know when people binge eat, their dopamine receptor density decreases. And even if I had the best medication in the world to add dopamine back to your brain, if you don't have the receptors, that medication isn't going to do a whole lot. And one of the best ways to add dopamine receptors is to support people in feeling like they belong, to support people in being around other humans, which in my experience, I can't say that I've treated any patients in the last 20 years who have no way, shape, or form of trauma. I know that was a double negative. So every patient that I've treated with an eating disorder and addiction in the last 20 years has had some form of trauma that, they may not have PTSD, but their trauma has impacted them. And at a very young age, this phenomenon happens. So if you're growing up with family dysfunction, if you're growing up where there's shame for other reasons swirling around the household, I oftentimes say shit rolls downhill. Attuned kids pick up on that, absorb it, and then play it out, and that has a early developmental brain-based decrease in dopamine receptors, which drives kids to seek replenishment of that. Sometimes that's through food. Sometimes that's through risk-taking. Many times, kids get diagnosed with ADHD and get put on stimulants at a very young age, not because they have ADHD, but because they have the beginnings of post-traumatic stress disorder or developmental trauma disorder, as Bessel van der Kolk says. So, I also haven't met too many people with eating disorders that think it's a great idea to go be part of a group. No, thank you. Can't we just do one-on-one forever?
Well, and I think it also explains a lot about COVID and how eating disorder spiked, right? Or food addiction. We definitely saw a huge increase in individuals who were reaching out to us because they realized, it's the pandemic, I was drinking maybe a little too much, but food is the lesser of the evil. So that's what I found out I was using instead. And so I think this dopamine response you're speaking of explains this quite clearly.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can answer our signature question, which is, if you could tell a younger version of yourself something about food addiction and or food addiction recovery, what would it be?
It's a really good question. I mean, probably, when I think about my college experience, it was like havoc was wreaked on a college experience. When I think about the things that I loved playing basketball, and that was affected. My relationships, like I have still like the best teammates and most supportive teammates in the world, but this addiction interferes with connection, right? Secrets kill, and damage relationships. So I think what I would tell my younger self is like, you deserve all of this. You deserve all of this connection. You're in a place now that has amazing people who actually care about you and would love to help you. Share it, share it with the people that are around you who, even if they don't know how to help you, will, go to bat for you and find somebody that can help you. So it's the shame piece. If I would have learned a long, long time ago that none of this was my fault, it's not your fault to have a disease. This is a disease. There are actually treatments for it. And today we can say that with a lot more confidence than we could, 20, 30 years ago.
I love that so much because it's so true. I think to some degree, everyone struggles with their relationship with food. And it's just one thing most people don't want to talk about.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We're definitely going to invite you back. We're definitely going to invite these ladies on as well for their own individual episodes.
Awesome.
And we just appreciate you so much in everything you do and for being a light for us. So keep fighting the good fight.
I do have a favor to ask of you two. Are you members of the Academy for Eating Disorders?
No.
Okay. So David Wiss and I are trying to keep the, I think right now it's called the Substance Use Disorders SIG, Special Interest Group, alive. They have special interest groups, probably 10 or 12 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's shocking to me that they're thinking of closing this one down, given how poorly treated this patient population is even today. So if you know anybody at the Academy, if you want to join yourselves, would love to have you in the special interest group where we're going to be doing some cool things like having monthly case consultations and other sorts of activities like that. So
I will sign up. I
Absolutely.
had no idea such a thing existed.
Yeah.
I will sign up for that. Yeah, I will join.
Awesome.
Thank
Cool.
you.
Yeah. No, if you guys know anyone, let me know.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anybody listening is a professional, join this group, the special interest group, and help out the cause. So
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies, Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life support group, I'm Sweet Enough. You can subscribe to our show in iTunes or Stitchers. That way you'll never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. Don't forget to pick up your copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies, which is available on Amazon. If you have any additional questions, both Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals and work one-on-one with clients. You can find their websites and email addresses in the show notes. Be sure to tune in every Friday when our new episodes drop. As Vera loves to say, the power is ours.